as I was listening to commentary about a replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I heard somebody say something that I found both true and frightening. And that is that judges have now become our politicians because Congress is not getting a whole lot done. Now, we could do a whole video about whether that should just be an accepted part of American political life, that we just let Congress off the hook and just take everything to court. But if that is in fact where we're at, then it would behoove all of us to understand how bias affects a judge's decision, and in particular, the justices on the Supreme Court. Now, we could look at this from a variety of different angles. We could talk about the environment. We could talk about religion. But in this video, I'm going to talk about the First Amendment as it relates to free speech and what one particular study found in regards to how judges make decisions for or against free speech rights, depending on their ideological bent. The study is called "Do Justices Defend the Speech They Hate? An Analysis of In-Group Bias on the U.S. Supreme Court." Now, in-group bias is something that everybody is susceptible to. It basically means I'm easier on my people and tougher on those who don't think like me. And when it comes to sort of your regular person, it's probably not that big of a deal. I mean, it definitely may hurt our ability to have good faith conversations with people who think differently than we do, but it really starts to matter when you get to a point where you have a significant position of power, like you're in the Supreme Court or like you're a journalist in mainstream media like I used to be. I think that this is one of the big issues in journalism that's not being talked about right now. In fact, it used to be, I saw sort of pre-Trump, that you as a journalist just sort of, you knew that you were susceptible to in-group bias, but you did everything you could to check it at the door and to be self-critical and self-aware and to think outside the box and not just let your folks off the hook and go tougher on those on the outside. Though I think there were certainly examples of that being problematic in journalism before what we've seen in the sort of post-Trump media era. Since Trump, though, it seems like there is more and more this sort of celebration of in-group bias, and not just among journalists, really among everybody. Unfortunately, when you're a journalist and you're supposed to have objectivity, that hurts your trust with the public, but you certainly can go on Twitter and not spend too long before you find journalists that are pretty obvious and in a lot of ways celebrating their in-group bias when it comes to especially covering the president, but covering issues of politics that may be related to presidential policy, for instance, COVID-19. And instead of being like, I'm going to be self-critical about my in-group bias, it's like, I'm going to celebrate my in-group bias almost as if I'm a moral crusader for showing you where I draw the line in the sand. Now, this study, of course, this looked at Supreme Court justices. This was done by Lee Epstein of Washington University in St. Louis, Christopher Parker, University of Rhode Island, and Jeffrey Siegel, Stony Brook University. They looked at votes cast between 1953 and 2014 to see how judges who leaned left voted on free speech issues versus judges who voted right on free speech issues. Their premise was this, that liberal judges would more likely defend the actions of free speech when those actions were taken for a liberal cause, and would be less likely to support actions taken in the name of free speech if those were in the name of a conservative cause, and then vice versa for the conservative judges, that a conservative judge would be more likely to support and defend a free speech issue if it was done in the name of conservative values, and would be less likely to vote in favor of defending free speech if the action was taken for liberal values and non-conservative values. And what they found was that conservative justices supported free speech actions 45% of the time when the speech was conservative versus 12% when the speech is liberal. And that liberal justices supported free speech action 92% of the time for liberal speech and 52% of the time for conservative speech. Whoever replaces Justice Ginsburg is likely also going to be susceptible to in-group bias, and also is likely going to preside over many of these free speech cases. The big talking point right now is the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. The part we're going to talk about today reads as follows. No provider or user of an internet computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. It's basically at the heart of the debate you may hear often if you follow YouTube a lot, and that is, should these platforms be considered a platform or a publisher, right? If they're a platform, some people will say then they shouldn't be able to just arbitrarily censor the content. If they're a publisher, they should be held to liability for doing so. Section 230 essentially gave the internet a freedom from liability for what people upload to the internet. It was done in order to allow a free flow of information on the internet so that the internet providers, these platforms, wouldn't feel like they were constantly going to be in court over what people uploaded. And the point was for there to sort of open this ability for all of us to have access to all kinds of different information without there being kind of a chilling effect that would come if litigation was an option. They are liable in some cases, though, for prosecution, including if the platform itself is breaking the law, whether it's federal, local, state. They can actually be sued even civilly in court for breaking the law. So they're not totally free from prosecution, but they do have a lot of protection. Now, this is an announcement from the Department of Justice about places that they say 230 is ripe for reform. That's exactly what it reads here. The department identified 4 areas ripe for reform. And again, this is sort of prompted over this argument that these platforms are acting as publishers by censoring certain content that they find to be offensive or for other reasons. They, under Section 230, are allowed to do that. That's not against the law. They're allowed to decide what they want on their platform and what they don't want on their platform. But if we go down to item number 4, promoting open discourse and greater transparency, what the Justice Department is calling for is to replace the catch-all otherwise objectionable language in Section 230 with unlawful and promotes terrorism. It says this reform would focus the broad blanket immunity for content moderation decisions on the core objective of Section 230 to reduce online content harmful to children, while limiting a platform's ability to remove content arbitrarily or in ways inconsistent with its terms or service simply by deeming it objectionable. President Trump has also been very vocal about this issue. He actually signed an executive order on online censorship because he says that they're making decisions with a dangerous amount of power. This is the executive order here. It says, executive order on preventing online censorship. And he says, when large, powerful social media companies censor opinions with which they disagree, they exercise a dangerous power. They cease functioning as passive bulletin boards and ought to be viewed and treated as content creators. It's not just people on the right, though, that are calling for a reform of Section 230 and how the internet works. There are also people on the left, for instance, who are concerned that Russia is interfering with elections by having the ability to post fake things on social media platforms, and that the social media or government entities should be able to comb through all that stuff and decide for us what is fake and what is not fake. From the libertarian perspective, though, a lot of people are saying leave Section 230 alone because, as you see in this article from Reason, which I think gives us a lot of food for thought, regardless of what side of the aisle you fall on, especially if you're somebody who wants to see a revision of Section 230. I think this makes some really good points. So again, I'm going to link this in the description. Section 230 is the internet's First Amendment. Now, both Republicans and Democrats want to take it away. And essentially what they say in Reason is that Section 230 has allowed the internet to operate in, though not a perfect way, in a way that has gotten us to where we are with the sharing of information. It's given us the opportunity to have a YouTube, to have even a Google search engine, because the search engines are not held liable for what news organizations, for instance, upload and those search engines can show you an article without endorsing it, where that could all change if Section 230 goes away, that even our retweeting something can be seen as an endorsement, and thereby we could be held liable. I'll just show you a couple of things that they bring up, where they say here that how 230 makes online argument possible, that essentially without Section 230, their argument is that all sorts of behind-the-scenes web publishing and speech dissemination tools would be in legal jeopardy, that companies would be more likely to just delete all user flag content, whether the report has merit or not, or at least hide reported content in order to do a review to make sure that it's legit or not. And now, once again, you've handed over potentially more power to the social media companies than they had before, because they're scared of litigation. And so they're going to be more likely to delete content. That's what they're saying. And that because of Section 230, search engines don't have to vet all the content of every news article they provide, that embedding or sharing someone else's social content doesn't make you legally liable for it, and that they argue that finding and sharing information online would essentially grow to be much harder than it already is. As somebody who has certainly faced the consequences of the arbitrary decision-making on these platforms, I can also completely understand why people do not want the government to get involved and how it could potentially make things a lot worse. So I definitely want to hear what you have to say about this. What do you think about Section 230? Do you think it should be revised, or do you think it should be left alone? I do think that free speech issues, especially as it relates to these platforms and Section 230, are going to be litigated more and more, especially as the public continues to discuss the kind of power that these platforms have to shape our dialogue and policy. And so it's something to pay attention to. Whoever replaces Ginsburg, what is their in-group bias? And what do you think they're going to do when a case about Section 230 potentially makes it to the Supreme Court? Again, I'm Allison Morrow. I'd love to hear what you think about this or other issues, whatever you'd like me to analyze in the future. Don't forget, you can support me with the links in the description. There's Patreon, there's PayPal, but it also just really helps if you share the content, like it, comment it, dislike it if you don't like it, but share it and give me your feedback, and I will see you next time.